Some stories never leave us, no matter how many years pass. Certain memories stay buried deep inside, weighing on our hearts, waiting for the right time to be told. What happened in the small desert town where I grew up is one of those memories. At first it seemed like just the arrival of a newcomer, an eloquent man full of pretty words and promises. But not everything that shines is gold, and I soon sensed something was off. Even today, I wonder how no one else saw what was coming. Good evening, Dom. My name is Gabriel, though everyone back in my hometown called me Gabby. I'm over 30 now, but the memories I want to share date back to when I was only 16. Back then, life was simple in our tiny community, tucked away between dusty desert roads and parched hills. Rain was always a blessing, and those winding dirt roads felt like a fragile link to the rest of the world. Nobody, not even our elders, could have imagined that the arrival of a traveling preacher, a man who called himself Elijah, would change our lives so profoundly and painfully. Before Elijah showed up, we had an old spiritual guide named Brother George. He lived in near seclusion in a small shack on the outskirts of town. He'd once been in seminary but never got ordained. Still, people respected him. He offered religious counsel, performed small rituals, and helped us understand Bible passages in plain language. Brother George was frail in health but strong in spirit. Sometimes he would sit by his humble door, greet anyone who happened to walk by, and share his life experiences. "Keep your faith," he would say whenever someone complained about our harsh desert life. God walks even in the driest corners of this world. As the months passed, though, his voice grew weaker and his advice became shorter. The community missed having a younger leader, someone to reinvigorate everyone's spirits. It was in this context that Elijah arrived. He appeared one sweltering late afternoon, walking along the dusty road carrying only a few belongings, a worn Bible he called the Living Word, and quietly humming a hymn. My mom, Jacqueline, was the first to see him from our window. She immediately called my dad. "Look, Sebastian, who do you think that man is? Could he be a drifter?" My dad came over to look, frowned a bit, and scratched his beard. "He's definitely come a long way. Seems like he's got no clear destination." Curious, I walked out to the gate. When Elijah approached, he noticed me standing there and gave me a dazzling smile, so white and bright it nearly blinded me. He carried himself with confidence, had long black hair tied in a ponytail, and wore simple but well-kept clothes. "Good afternoon," he greeted me. "Could you point me to Brother George? I need to have a word with him." For a split second, I felt a chill I couldn't explain. There was a hypnotic quality to his voice. I pointed him in the right direction, and he walked off without hesitation. It didn't take long for Elijah to win the town's admiration. At first, people were just curious. Who was this stranger with a Bible in hand and a charismatic speaking style? He held impromptu outdoor sermons on Sunday afternoons, once the punishing sun started to wane. He spoke of perseverance, faith, and hope. He seemed to know Bible passages even Brother George never mentioned. In these sermons, he mixed his preachings with anecdotes and parables, making them pleasant and easy to digest. People tired of Brother George's silence felt a renewal of energy. In no time, Elijah got permission to hold prayer gatherings in our makeshift chapel, a small community-built hall. It was a simple place, but it meant a great deal to us. Over the following weeks, the chapel started filling up more and more. Folks who only came on special occasions began attending nearly every day to hear this new preacher. My mother, a devout woman, was quite taken by him. "This Elijah has a gift with words," she would say at dinner. "It's like he can see right into us and knows exactly what we need to hear." My dad, more reserved, would just nod. My younger sister Martha kept praising Elijah's inspiring stories. I listened silently, intrigued by his magnetism. Yes, he was friendly, and he seemed genuinely interested in everyone's troubles. But some part of me stayed guarded, as if my gut was warning me not to fully trust him. After a few weeks, Elijah announced he would settle in our community, claiming God had guided him there. He said he intended to bring the light of true faith. Brother George, though weak, agreed to let Elijah build a small room by his shack. A lot of people helped with construction, bringing wood, tools, anything they could spare. Even I pitched in. I have to admit that at first, I admired the way Elijah led everyone, always encouraging us with kind words and friendly gestures. But changes soon followed. Elijah began hosting late-night prayer meetings exclusively for the town's youth. He said these gatherings were meant for those whose spirit isn't yet tainted by the world's evils. Initially, few people found it odd. Even Brother George, without the energy to question it, seemed to go along. However, I started noticing that some of my girlfriends came back from these night meetings acting strange. Rosa, once cheerful and chatty, became withdrawn and distant. Carla, who loved dancing at local fairs, was now obsessed with Elijah's divine message. When I asked her what that message was, she'd give vague answers or change the subject. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed Elijah spent too much private time with young women under the guise of cleansing their sins. Others said he showed a different side in private settings, where he was harsh, even authoritarian. Without proof, it all remained gossip. After all, it was tough to believe that a man who came so full of good intentions could have a dark side. My mother brushed off the criticism. "Stop with this nonsense. Elijah is a man of God. Jealous people love to ruin someone's reputation." I kept my observations to myself, but the tension in town grew palpable. What intrigued me most was Elijah's fascination with the old reservoir outside town, a natural basin formed by a few small creeks. It wasn't exactly a lake, but we used it as a source of water and occasionally for a bit of recreation. Elijah seldom talked about it openly, but he was drawn to it. He'd walk around that area, saying the solitude gave him visions and revelations. One day Elijah arrived at one of his services, brimming with excitement. The air was thick, hinting at one of those rare desert storms. He opened his Bible, but instead of reading a recognizable passage, he spoke about a divine vision he'd received at the reservoir. He said he heard a voice from the waters commanding him to form a group of believers entirely devoted to God's service, a group that would forsake worldly pleasures to focus solely on faith. He called this new group the Circle of Light. His announcement had an immediate impact. Inside our makeshift chapel, people looked around at each other, but after Elijah's passionate speech, most accepted the idea eagerly. He said the Circle of Light members would purify the desert, spreading true faith everywhere. He promised miracles, healings, and an intimacy with the divine few would ever attain, provided people dedicated themselves wholeheartedly. My sister Martha volunteered right away. That surprised me because she'd never been so enthusiastic about religion. Even so, my mother was proud of her. Within days, more young women signed up. They started meeting Elijah at the reservoir at random hours, sometimes at sunrise, sometimes late at night. Over time, I watched my sister's personality shift. Martha, who loved singing and playing guitar, now barely spoke, and when she did, she repeated lines from Elijah's sermons. It was as though her old spark was gone, replaced by a blank stare or exhaustion. When I asked her about it, she'd only say, "I'm closer to God now, Gabby. You should understand. Elijah guides us." Neither my dad nor my mum seemed alarmed. In fact, they were pleased Martha was getting so involved in something they deemed so pure. I, however, was uneasy. Some in the community also began questioning the unusual gatherings at the reservoir. Mr. Bennett, an older man who often fished there, said he'd seen Elijah and the young women standing in a circle by the water, holding lit candles and murmuring strange words. "I've never seen anything like it," he told my dad. "It's like they're talking to the wind or the water itself." My dad didn't probe further. He respected Elijah and disliked gossip. Still, for me, Mr. Bennett's words confirmed that something was wrong. Before long, the community let Elijah take over a small abandoned farm nearby, owned by a family that had moved to the city. The place was in ruins, but Elijah said it would become a sanctuary, a retreat center for Circle of Light members. He asked everyone in town to help with the repairs, promising the farm would be a holy place that would bring blessings to us all. Excitement filled the air. We organized work teams. Children, adults, and the elderly worked together, cleaning, planting a small garden, and mending broken walls. Elijah was always in the thick of it, giving instructions, firmly yet with a friendly smile that made people feel valued. In a few weeks, the farm was ready to house its first permanent residents, the young women of the Circle of Light. My mum saw it as a chance for Martha to grow in her faith. Martha moved in completely, and soon we rarely saw her. Occasionally, she'd come back to grab clothes or some belongings. but she seemed even more distant than before. It was like she was living in a separate reality. I felt compelled to act. One evening, I hid behind a cluster of scraggly mesquite trees near the reservoir, waiting for Elijah and some of his followers to arrive. They formed a circle at the water's edge, and I could make out Martha among them, holding a candle. Elijah spoke in a low voice, but the desert silence allowed me to catch a few words. They didn't sound like normal Bible verses, more like prayers in a language I couldn't place. Suddenly the air seemed charged, as if a storm were brewing, but the sky was clear. I tried to move closer without making noise, but I accidentally stepped on a dry branch. The crack echoed, and Elijah fell silent. Everyone turned in my direction. I dropped low, my heart pounding. After a tense moment, they resumed their chanting. As soon as they left, I ran home trembling. I barely slept that night, haunted by what I'd seen. In the following weeks, a number of families voiced concern. More girls moved into the farm but came back looking exhausted, dark circles under their eyes, lost in some distant daze. Rumors surfaced that Elijah enforced strict fasts, saying sacrifice led to purification. Mrs. Mary Dorsey, whose daughter had joined the circle, confronted Elijah one evening, demanding an explanation for her child's frail condition. He remained calm. "The path of faith is tough and requires surrender," he answered softly. "Your daughter is being prepared for something greater. Trust the process." For most people there, that was enough. But Mrs. Dorsey stayed suspicious. She was among the first to speak openly about the possibility that Elijah was exploiting people's faith. Still, few believed her. Many were too taken by his promises. Brother George, our ailing hermit, could hardly walk by then, yet he seemed increasingly uneasy. One afternoon he called me over to his shack. "Gabby, I sense great evil looming over this town." His voice was weak but steady. "Elijah is not who he says he is. You must be careful, child." I was surprised he'd chosen me. "Why me?" I asked. "Because I see in you the courage I no longer have." He coughed and went on. "Something about Elijah's faith doesn't come from God. If this continues, we will all suffer." I got goosebumps. I asked him what we could do, but he said he was too old and feeble to fight. He only begged me to protect myself and those I loved. I tried telling my mom about it that same day, but she wouldn't listen. "Brother George is just confused," she said. "He doesn't realize Elijah came to bless us." Not long after, something odd happened at the reservoir. Dead fish started washing ashore with no sign of disease or pollution. Some blamed the drought or a natural phenomenon. Elijah, however, made a statement that rattled everyone. "It's a sign," he declared during a sermon. "A great test is coming. Only true believers will endure." Looking around at my neighbors, I saw fear and blind devotion in equal measure. The stranger things got, the more people clung to him. Whether it was desperation or some sort of mass persuasion, I can't say for sure, but few dared doubt him. Meanwhile, the young women at the Circle of Light farm behaved even more strangely, always fatigued, some fainting for no apparent reason. Martha stopped visiting home altogether. When I asked my mum if she was worried, she'd say, "Elijah knows what he's doing." My dad, equally uneasy, still avoided confrontation. He respected faith but sensed danger. Even so, he remained silent, torn between wanting to protect Martha and fearing any direct challenge to Elijah. That's when Mrs. Dorsey and some others reached out to the local diocese in the next county, begging them to investigate Elijah. Word spread, but around that time, one of the town's community leaders, Mr. Morris, suddenly died from an unknown illness. He'd been vocal in criticizing Elijah, which only fueled suspicions something dark was going on. My determination to uncover the truth outweighed my fear. One moonlit night, I followed Elijah again. He and a handful of followers left the farm and headed for the reservoir. By then, I knew exactly where to hide without being spotted. From my hiding place, I witnessed something that still haunts me. About 7 young women, including Martha, formed a circle with lit candles. Elijah stood in the center, arms raised to the sky, chanting in a language I didn't recognize. Definitely not English or Latin or anything I'd heard in normal church services. The girls appeared entranced. Suddenly, the water began rippling as though something beneath the surface was boiling up. A chill went through me. I saw Martha's eyes rolling back, her face twisted in a mix of ecstasy and pain. I fought the urge to scream. Then Elijah placed his hands close to the water's surface, and the noise stopped. For a moment, everything felt lighter, but then a fierce gust of wind shook the trees. The girls' candles went out all at once, plunging the area into darkness. Panicking, I crept away, heart pounding, certain they had heard me. I made it home breathless and cold with sweat. The next day I broke down and told my dad everything, hoping he'd finally take action. He stared at me stunned. "Gabby, are you sure about what you saw?" I swore it was true, tears in my eyes. For the first time, he seemed ready to act. He left to meet Mrs. Dorsey and others who doubted Elijah, trying to plan a response. But Elijah was quicker. Before my dad returned, Elijah spoke at Sunday service, claiming that some people were blaspheming against God's work, that demonic forces were trying to corrupt the circle of light. He warned everyone not to believe the lies and to stand firm in their faith. I was there and I felt his eyes linger on me. It was suffocating. I felt like every person around me was watching my every move. A few weeks later, 2 priests from the neighboring diocese finally arrived, Father Andrew and Father Damien. They were serious, respectful, and somewhat skeptical of the rumors. They said they would investigate. The entire community gathered at the chapel to greet them. Elijah appeared as charming as ever, shaking hands and welcoming the newcomers. It seemed like it would be a calm inspection. Elijah led the priests around the farm, showing them the rooms and living spaces. The women, however, looked nervous and barely spoke. Father Andrew noticed how thin some of them were and questioned Elijah about their meals. Elijah offered vague replies about sacrifice and purification. When they reached the reservoir, Elijah refused to go farther, saying it was too sacred for unbelieving eyes. The priests found that strange but didn't push the issue just then, deciding to return another day, perhaps with more support. Still, their presence gave me some hope. That very night, a rare and violent storm raged over the town. Lightning tore across the sky and thunder shook the ground. Between the thunderclaps, I heard screams outside. Rushing out, I saw Elijah near the chapel doors, shouting incoherent words. He looked possessed by a furious rage. A few of his young followers tried to hold him back, but he broke free, yelling, "You have no idea what's coming, only I can save you." It was terrifying. Moments later, he ran toward the brush leading to the reservoir and disappeared into the darkness. The young women stayed behind, soaked and shivering in the rain, sobbing and clearly in shock. The next day, Father Andrew and Father Damien, joined by locals who no longer trusted Elijah, searched the farm from top to bottom. My father and I went too. We found notebooks filled with bizarre notes and symbols, runes or occult sigils, along with disturbing drawings of men and women kneeling before some misshapen creature. In another room, we uncovered an improvised altar with black candles, animal sacrifices, and personal items belonging to the young women. Hair clips, bracelets, ribbons. The stench was overpowering. I had to cover my nose. Martha was nowhere to be found. In fact, only a few of the girls were still there. Most had vanished with Elijah in the storm. Those who remained were disoriented, some fainting from weakness. Father Andrew prayed fervently while Father Damien tried to comfort the ones who were crying. My dad, pale as a ghost, squeezed my hand. "We have to find Martha," he whispered. We organized 2 search parties. One headed toward the reservoir, the other took the road out of town. I joined the group heading to the water. The trail was thick with mud from the storm, making every step difficult. The sky was still dark with clouds. When we reached the reservoir, we found a chilling sight. Candles scattered along the shore and evidence of some recent ritual. Strange markings on the ground, dark stains that could have been blood. Father Damien made the sign of the cross, murmuring a prayer while my heart pounded in my chest, terrified I might find Martha among the worst of it. To our relief and dismay at the same time, there was no sign of her or Elijah. All we saw was a low-hanging mist over the water, a rare sight in daylight, and a silence so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath. Days turned into weeks without any trace of Elijah or the missing young women. Rumors claimed he'd fled to another state. Others swore they'd spotted ghostly figures around the reservoir on moonless nights. The diocese issued warnings about false prophets and sent more clergy to support the shaken residents. The town sank into gloom. Many families left, hoping to start over elsewhere. I refused to leave until I had some news about Martha. But after months with no leads, I gave in. My mother fell ill from worry, and my father seemed older by the day, carrying a silent guilt for not protecting Martha sooner. We decided to move to a bigger city so my mother could get treatment and we could escape the dark legacy Elijah left behind. Years passed. Only much later did we hear from old neighbors that bodies were found in a cave near the reservoir, badly decomposed and unidentifiable. Some said they were animals. Others, horrified, claimed there were human remains mixed in. The local authorities closed the case for lack of evidence. We never got official confirmation on whether Martha was there. Still, rumors persist. Some folks swear that on stormy nights you can hear chanting and wails echoing off the reservoir. Others say Elijah has been seen in distant towns, always with 2 or 3 blank-eyed women at his side, continuing his dark ministry. No one knows the truth for sure. All I can say is that the wound that preacher left behind never truly healed for my family. My mother passed away a few years later, never recovering from losing her daughter. My father grew old before his time, burdened by the regret of not protecting Martha more boldly. And as for me, despite moving on with my life, I still bear the shadows of those days. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, haunted by Elijah's voice and the sight of those churning waters, as if they're still calling out to me. Be very careful where you place your faith, and that's the advice I leave you with. There are forces in this world that wear the cloak of religion or goodness, yet behind it lies only deceit and darkness. And when such forces find fertile ground, nowhere is truly safe, be it a sprawling city or a small forgotten town in the desert. Before we move on to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to get the latest stories. Your presence means a lot, and your support is essential. All right, let's keep going. When my husband and I decided to remodel our house, we never imagined that tearing down old walls would bring back certain memories I had spent years trying to forget. I've always been a very practical person. While I enjoy listening to ghost stories, I never took anything supernatural too seriously. To this day, I'm not sure if what happened was just a coincidence or if it involves something beyond my understanding. But I'll start from the beginning, as faithfully as possible so that everyone can draw their own conclusions. The house we live in was built many decades ago. We bought it when our oldest son was still small. At the time, we planned to do some minor improvements, but family life kept us too busy. Work, the kids' school, bills, and the years just slipped by. Only after our children grew up and went away to college, leaving the house quiet and empty, did we finally feel motivated to start the renovation. Before I get to the part about the mirror, though, I have to go back a few years when my oldest son was around 8. It was around that time that I first noticed he was sleepwalking. Back then, I used to wake up during the night to check on the kids, close windows, make sure the doors were locked. I've always been a light sleeper, so any little noise would alert me. That's how I ran into him one early morning, standing in the hallway as though he didn't know where he was. His eyes were open, but he looked right through me as if he couldn't really see me. At first, I didn't find it frightening. I knew childhood sleepwalking wasn't all that uncommon. Some friends had told me their kids went through similar phases. Still, every time I saw him there in the hallway, I felt a bit uneasy. He would sway slightly as though trying to keep balance on a boat. With every step I took toward him, I noticed his eyes were fixed on something I couldn't see. It gave me chills, even though I tried to stay calm as I guided him back to bed. My husband, on the other hand, is an extremely heavy sleeper and almost never woke up when I called him. Most of the time, when I returned to our bedroom after leading my son back, my husband was still fast asleep. Only when the sleepwalking became more frequent did he witness it himself. I recall one night when he got up to use the bathroom and found our boy standing there, whispering unintelligible words. My husband came back to bed pale and unsure what to do. Seeing his reaction made me realize that even though we tried to brush it off as just a phase, it was truly unsettling. Everything remained relatively under control for a few months until an incident left me particularly intrigued. Late one night, I was almost asleep when I heard a soft, rhythmic noise. At first, I thought it was a dripping faucet because it sounded like water hitting a surface, but it wasn't raining, and as I stayed still in bed, I realized the sound had a very regular cadence, as if someone was tapping lightly on something at consistent intervals. I glanced at my husband. He was out cold, and to be honest, I didn't want to wake him. I wasn't scared at that moment, just extremely curious. So I got up slowly and followed the sound into the hallway. That's where I found my oldest son facing the wall, gently leaning his forehead and fingertips against it, moving back and forth. Each tiny push created a soft, dull thud. It wasn't strong enough to hurt him, but it made me feel uneasy. It looked like some mechanical ritual, an instinctive search for something. I tried calling him, but he didn't respond. The way he moved made me freeze for a few seconds. Finally, I mustered the courage to put my hand on his shoulder and pull him back. He blinked, looked at me blankly, and let me guide him to bed as though nothing had happened. The next day, as usual, he remembered nothing. That routine repeated, though not frequently. I had my own theory that in his sleepwalking state, he might feel the wall and try to push through it, not understanding it was solid. I never knew if that made any sense. Still, I tried not to panic. The pediatrician reassured us that childhood sleepwalking can happen and often resolves over time. Indeed, my oldest son gradually stopped sleepwalking, and the memory of it became a strange part of his childhood. Time went by, and when my oldest was entering his teens, his sleepwalking episodes practically vanished. I was relieved to finally sleep without being so on edge. But a few years later, the same behavior showed up in my younger son. He was about 9 when I started noticing him wandering around the house at night. His sleepwalking was eerily similar, eyes open yet unfocused, a subtle swaying in his posture, slow breathing. Having gone through this before gave me a chill. It was as though the scene was repeating itself almost exactly. I tried to keep the same calm approach I had used with my older son. I'd get out of bed, gently guide him back, whispering soothing words. And like his brother, he didn't seem to hear me at all. I wasn't sure what to think. I tried telling myself that sleepwalking could be hereditary and that it made perfect sense for both children to experience it. Yet, everything about it felt hauntingly identical. What truly rattled me was one night when I woke up again to the same type of soft tapping on the wall. My heart started pounding before I even opened my eyes, because I recognized that steady, monotonous sound. When I stood up and looked down the hallway, there was my younger son, standing at that exact same part of the wall, tapping his forehead in a steady rhythm. The scene was so similar to what I had witnessed years before that. For a moment I felt I had traveled back in time. Even the way he moved his fingers, almost caressing the wall, was the same. I stopped and thought he never saw his brother do this. The older one's episodes had ended long before the younger was old enough to notice any midnight wanderings. So how could he imitate something he'd never even witnessed? I tried to reason it out, but no explanation satisfied me. Watching him repeat the same motions gave me such a strong sense of déjà vu that I had to take a deep breath before touching his shoulder. Only when I gently shook him did he stop and allow me to lead him back to his room. Like his brother, he remembered nothing the next morning. Fortunately, after a few months, he also stopped sleepwalking. Life went on as usual. Over time, these episodes became nothing more than family stories that we'd recall every now and then without much seriousness, until the remodeling began. Both of my sons moved away for college and the house got quiet. My husband and I decided it was finally time to remodel. We started with simple changes: new flooring, painting the walls, updating the kitchen and bathrooms. We thought about replacing doors, maybe knocking down a wall or two for a more open concept. Nothing too drastic, but enough to give the place a fresh look. One morning we decided to remove an old wallpaper that covered most of the hallway. It was a dated floral pattern, something we'd inherited from the previous owners, and that had never really matched our style. As we began peeling it off, we noticed a shiny surface underneath one section. I thought maybe it was some plastic or metal someone had left behind. But as we continued peeling, it became clear it was a mirror. An old mirror, embedded right into the wall, with no visible frame. The surface was cloudy, showing dark patches. It looked very old, possibly part of the original construction since the house had gone through multiple renovations over the decades. I wondered why anyone would paper over a mirror instead of removing it. The moment I realized it really was a mirror, I felt a chill run down my spine. For a second, I stood there frozen, staring at the tarnished glass. I instantly remembered my sons and how they used to bump their foreheads against that exact part of the wall. It was like seeing the last piece of a puzzle I didn't even know was missing. My husband also found it strange. He pointed out that the mirror was big enough to have been used somewhere else in the house, so why seal it up like that? We didn't find any notes or inscriptions, nothing that suggested anything supernatural or sinister. Still, the mere coincidence of the mirror being located exactly where my children used to stop, in a trance, unnerved me. Facing that unexpected discovery, I briefly considered leaving it alone and just covering the mirror back up. But curiosity got the better of me. My husband suggested removing it carefully, maybe trying to restore it or at least keep it as a quirky memento. But honestly, I didn't want it in our home. I had this strange feeling, like it didn't belong to us and had somehow caused those sleepwalking incidents. In the end, we took out the mirror and threw it away. Maybe that was rash, but we just couldn't see a good reason to keep it. After that, we patched the hole in the wall with joint compound and a fresh coat of paint. Today, when I walk down that hallway, I no longer get that unsettling feeling, though I still remember the blank expressions on my children's faces, night after night. After all this, I tried to come up with rational explanations. Maybe it was just a coincidence. My sons had sleepwalking issues, something that can be genetic or triggered by anxiety, lack of sleep, and many other factors. And they just happened to stop at that spot because it was darker or cooler, or maybe there was an odd draft. As for the old mirror, maybe someone had covered it up to keep it from breaking, or simply because the previous owner preferred wallpaper to a mirror. At the same time, I can't completely shake the unease of seeing both of them, years apart, drawn to the exact place where that hidden mirror was, as though something there attracted them in their sleep. I'm not saying I believe in ghosts or hidden forces, but it did make me question things I once dismissed. Now my sons are grown, healthy, and they see their sleepwalking years as a murky part of their childhood. They laugh when I mention what we found during the remodel, but they still get a bit thoughtful. Neither remembers feeling anything special in that part of the house. For them, it's just a weird coincidence. Although my oldest sometimes admits he gets a slight shiver recalling how he'd wake up confused in the hallway. Even so, there are no more nightly taps on the wall, no footsteps in the middle of the night. The house, now remodeled, feels brighter, more modern, and at least for me, more peaceful. Some nights, I catch myself staring down the hallway, remembering the past. And while I don't have any definitive answers, I can at least say that uneasy feeling vanished along with the hidden mirror. Maybe not everything needs a logical explanation, or maybe we just haven't found it. Either way, this is my story, and I'd rather leave it open-ended so everyone can interpret it as they wish. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to stay updated on all future narrations. I post new videos here every day. I hope to see you in the next one. On the screen now, I'm leaving 2 other great videos I know you'll enjoy. See you there.